Hello everyone and welcome into the final edition of the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this wonderful Friday afternoon to conclude the week. As always, it is Stardom Sit-'em Day. First round of your fantasy playoffs starts this weekend, and it should be a good one, so you want to make all your last minute decisions correctly, and hopefully these two Stardom Sit-in segments will help out. As you know, I love compiling lists of each position in terms of who I think could be starting options or you might want to leave on the bench, and for your first round playoff matchup, this one could prove to be vital in terms of your decision making. Then I look at the biggest games of the NFL weekend in terms of huge fantasy stakes, whether they be underrated or potential Super Bowl matchups, kind of hinting at some of those big games ahead. And then concluding with a very important game in its own right. Sunday night, my Seattle Seahawks at home against the Green Bay Packers, renewing one of the NFC's biggest rivalries over the past 2 decades, this time with both Geno Smith and Jordan Love at the helm. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, if you want more content such as this, whether it be segments or shorts for today's shows and all around the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the shows and the network itself to keep up to date on all our content. But if you want to contribute and interact with us a little bit more directly while we're live streaming our shows, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube or through our website, gsmcspodcast.net. You can do one of two things: leave a tip or donation through our website or here on YouTube, or leave any questions, comments, or concerns you may have throughout the show, and I will gladly read them on air. I love hearing all your opinions. It just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day here on today's show, starting off with my favorite starts of the week. As always, I compile lists of every position, rank them each week, come up with players who I believe could be viable starts. This is a list of every single player from every position who I believe could be the guaranteed starter this week. And in terms of Week 15, first round of the fantasy playoffs, this one could prove to be the most integral in helping you reach your goals for the season in fantasy. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. When I think about this list as well, it's not always about the superstars, right? Eventually, as we get to the latter rounds of the playoffs, I'm going to be more hyper-focused on the big players at each position, but I do still think there's merit in starting certain players who might go under the radar in this first round matchup, just to see if they can carry over the potential they've shown these past couple of weeks. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off the QB position. This might not be a guy who's very popular right now in terms of a fantasy playoff perspective, but if you still have him on your roster, I think this matchup could prove to be an intriguing one to start him in. I'm talking about Mr. Justin Herbert. A lot of people might be surprised by this because it's going to be a very tough game against a physical Bucs team. Looks primed to go on another late playoff run to get into the NFC playoff picture. But I do think that Justin Herbert is one of those guys who can ramp it up at any given time. I know it's a little bit more difficult now that he has a head coach who wants him to rely more on his backfield, but right now the backfield isn't delivering for him. And we know that he has fantastic ability in terms of keeping this offense on schedule on his own, playing hero ball than a lot of other quarterbacks around the NFL. So, if Justin Herbert can revert back to a little bit of that hero ball play he had under the Brandon Staley era, chances are this game's going to be a lot more close and, most importantly, high scoring than people think. So I do believe that Justin Herbert has all the quality and players he needs to make timely plays to keep up with this Bucs team on paper. But hopefully it translates to the field, because I really am taking a chance with him, because a lot of people may have already determined who their QB1 in this first playoff game will be. But if you still are looking at the QB position and are having questions or second thoughts about who you might want to start, consider Justin Herbert, because he still has that big playability, and we still know that he has that hero ball potential. each and every single week. It's just that in this new system, you don't get to see it that often. But in this game, look for him to come out firing on all cylinders. Then at the running back position, this one is more easy to determine here. Saquon Barkley. And yes, this is perhaps the toughest matchup he's had to date against a very physical front seven for Pittsburgh. But I do think, like I said earlier in the week, he is going to be the X factor in this one, because I do believe, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth later when we look at certain games with big fantasy stakes. I do believe that this is going to be a very defensive game. Two of the top defenses in the league we're talking about here. And two quarterbacks who are too over-reliant on certain things. If you look at Russ, right? He's someone, and I know we're supposed to be talking about Saquon. I'll get to that point in a bit. We look at Russ, right? Chances are he's always going to be looking for the downfield pass more so than coming into the middle of the field. Yes, he's starting to rely on Freiermuth a little bit, who we'll talk about as well later in the show. But I do believe he's still a little bit too over-reliant on that deep ball, whereas Jalen Hurts is a little bit too reliant on Saquon himself. And it's reaped rewards so far. But in this matchup, I want to see Saquon be a little bit more involved in the all-around outlook of this offense, rather than just being the end-all, be-all for them. Because he is an elite running back for Philly, and has really transformed this offense for Philly as well. But I do want to see him get more involved in certain situations rather than just be the answer for them on offense. But I still think that he's a viable fantasy asset just because of his Swiss Army knife abilities in this offense for them. Then at the wide receiver position, we look at a guy coming off a bye who really wants to get it going again. And he has a perfect matchup to do just that. It is Terry McLaurin. Definitely not one of the most popular top-tier receivers out there right now from a playoff perspective. You might already be thinking of certain guys like Jefferson or other. But I do think that Terry McLaurin is still someone in this Commanders offense that commands a lot of attention, no pun intended, and is going to be a huge difference maker for them on the stretch. They're still right in the thick of the wild card chase. They have the Rams breathing on their neck, and potentially, if Seattle, falls out of the NFC West race, they might have to compare records at the end of it, and potentially that leaves Washington out of the race. So, Terry McLaurin's going to be a very important player in the NFL landscape and in the fantasy landscape as well, because I think Jalen Daniels might want to get back to that connection as often as possible in these last 4 games. And not for nothing, Commanders aren't out of the woods just yet. They have a very easy schedule on the stretch at the Saints and Falcons. They have 2 divisional matchups, one against the Eagles in 2 weeks and one with the Cowboys in the last week of the season, that could potentially be trap games. The Cowboys game more so than the Philadelphia game, because I do think Philly is going to want to get that head-to-head tiebreaker over and done with. But I do think that last game of the season could be a tricky one. So look for Terry McLaurin to be a very important aspect, not just the Commanders' offense, but the fantasy landscape going forward because of his importance to this Washington team. So look for him to command attention early and often in this game, in future games as well, and potentially define the fantasy playoffs for you at the wide receiver position. In the tight end position, this has been a guy who's been disappointing for a little bit in terms of touchdown production, but certainly not in terms of reliance in this offense. How about Trey McBride? They still rely on this guy in the Arizona offense. It's just that a lot of defenses have kind of keyed in on him, and it's really disrupted the rhythm of what he was doing earlier in the season. And so in this matchup against the Patriots, though, I do think that the Patriots may be a little bit too concerned with guarding Marvin Harrison Jr. and his downfield abilities in the middle of the field. And they really don't necessarily have the best linebacking core to disrupt what Trey McBride can do in the middle of the field. He's going to get a lot of targets there. He's going to get a lot of targets in the red zone, I believe, as a result as well. So look for Trey McBride to pick up kind of where he left off in terms of production, potentially get into the end zone, unlike what he's been able to do these past 3 weeks, because he is still that special player for Arizona. And Arizona is still in the thick of this thing. They as well can still win the NFC West. It's going to be tough for them, But ultimately, they are still very much in the NFC playoff picture, and Trey McBride can be a big reason why, and their schedule as well is a big reason why. They have perhaps the easiest schedule of any remaining NFC West team thus far in terms of controlling their own destiny and in terms of overall opponents. So Trey McBride can have a big say in how the end of the season goes for Arizona, and in this game, he's going to want to set the tone right from the bat. So look for him to continue his development in this offense and his importance in this offense as well. And last but not least, let's talk about an underrated defense here that a lot of people might not really be starting in terms of playoff standpoint, but could in certain matchups, because I do think this defense is better than the sum of its parts and better than what their record states. It is the Raiders' defense. It's not their fault. The offense has been through a lot of turmoil this season. They have the talent needed to be an elite defense in this league. And no matter what the decisions are made in the offseason and what turnover comes as a result, there's still a defense with elite players. They have Christian Wilkins. They have Max Crosby. They have guys like Robert Spillane and Malcolm Kuntz who are really tough motor guys. They have guys in the secondary who are really rounding into their own. This is a well-rounded defense, and against the Falcons, who are in trouble in terms of offensive output over these past 4 weeks, I really think that defense will matter in this matchup. And as a result, we're going to see this be a defensive slugfest that I do believe that the Raiders can come out on top in terms of generating takeaways in. That's why I feel like, yes, from a fantasy standpoint, you don't want to be risking it on a defense that has a bad record and a team that has a bad record as well. But look for this to be one of those games where the Raiders can keep it close because of their defensive prowess. Let me know what you think in the comments about this, because I want it to be as inclusive as possible. I know it's the first week of playoffs, but I want to talk about certain players who might go underrated or understated in the fantasy playoff that you might want to pay a little bit more attention to. But coming up after the break, we're going to have to transition into more of a negative tone, because we're going to be talking about some guys you might have to bench in terms of your first round fantasy playoff matchup. So we'll be right back right after this short break to talk about them.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And before we get into our second segment of the day, I do want to remind you that if throughout the show you feel so inclined to either leave a tip or donation, or have a question, comment, or concern you want to put in the comments section, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube or our website, gsmcspodcast.net, as you can see on the ticker right there on my screen. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. Just makes it that much better. I love hearing your guys' opinions, and I love getting them on air as well. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of today's show. And let's talk about some players you might want to avoid in your fantasy playoffs, because these players, while not necessarily going to be as monitored throughout the fantasy postseason, they definitely still could hold merit to certain people and certain owners in certain situations especially. But I'm here to tell you that sometimes you just can't take the risk. And I feel like this is going to be a very matchups-oriented fantasy playoffs. We're going to have to pick and choose your moments where certain players either are guaranteed starters or are not. And it's going to be difficult in some situations because this is crunch time for a lot of these playoff hopefuls here. So you never really know who's going to be viable week in, week out. But ultimately, these are the guys this week that you just don't want to risk because it's the first round of the fantasy playoffs and the stakes are too high. Without further ado, let's talk about them. Starting off with a pretty obvious one at QB. I'm not necessarily certain many people in terms of fantasy playoff hopefuls have this guy still on their roster, but they do, and they're in, say, a deeper league where he could potentially be either a QB2 or a flex option. This is where you shy away from him in this matchup. Anthony Richardson. This is not an indictment of the guy. I still think he has fantastic potential to be something in the NFL. It's just that A, we have a very small sample size of what he looks like in this league, and B, he's in a very interesting matchup, right? We're going to talk about this one a little bit more in depth in our next segment against the Broncos. Both these teams still fighting for their playoff lives in the AFC. When I look at both of these teams, I think that this defense is the difference for Denver, and that's why I'm a little concerned about Anthony Richardson in this one. And I know a lot of people are already saying, well, I'm probably not going to start him anyways, or he's most likely, if he is going to start, going to be a flex option for me. Don't even take that risk because Anthony Richardson, as much as I love him, he's too boom or bust, and he's too unreliable in these situations. And it's going to come to a head in a very important matchup for Indianapolis. I just feel like this Indianapolis Colts team is not quite a playoff team. There have been glimpses of what they can be, but right now, they're going to prove that I feel they're 1 or 2 seasons away from truly being at least a wild card contender in the AFC. I do think they're incredibly coached, and I love what Shane Steichen is able to do with Anthony Richardson, but I do think that they need to continue to develop him. They need to continue to see positives out of his gameplay. And right now, there have been a little bit, but there haven't been enough to show me that he can be consistent in both real life and in fantasy. That's why I say shy away from him in this particular matchup. And then in terms of the running back position, this has been a guy who's kind of been popular in terms of waiver wire additions over the past couple of weeks because he has looked pretty bright these past couple of games. But I do think in this very weird matchup for the Bengals against a Titans squad that I highly appreciate in terms of the defensive side of football, I think Chase Brown is going to see a little bit of decline in form. Now, I do think that right now he is the best running back that the Bengals have. And it is kind of no coincidence as Zach Moss is hurt, so he's kind of forced to be. But I do think that when we compare both him and Moss, there's a lot more explosiveness in this Bengals offense with Chase Brown in it, and it opens up a lot for Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and different receivers in this pass game. And so the reason why I think that this is an opportunity to kind of sell Chase Brown high is because this Titans defense can play spoiler to not just teams in the playoff race, but teams like the Bengals who are too over-reliant on offense. They kind of got away with it against Dallas as well, where Chase Brown had arguably his best game of the season. But in this matchup, I feel that this Titans defense can keep it much closer than people expect. And I said as much when I put them in my defensive rankings for this week. So that's why I think that this is going to be a tough situation for Chase Brown, because as much as they like him, based off all the hype he's been generating these past couple of weeks, and whether or not you've gotten him off the waiver wire, I still think that this matchup is not going to be an easy sledding for Chase Brown right now, because I truly believe this Titans defense is legitimate, and I hope they invested in enough that in the long-term future, we see major improvements from this overall squad. So that's why I feel like Chase Brown right now is not necessarily going to be a viable option for your first-round matchup. Then the wide receiver position. This may surprise some people, but I do think this is arguably a very tough matchup for this particular guy in Mike Evans. Now, I do believe that this Bucs-Chargers game could see a lot of points from both offenses because both of these quarterbacks, Baker Mayfield and Justin Herbert, are highly capable of playing swashbuckling styles of football. But The reason why I think this is going to be a tough out for Mike Evans here is because of the depth of this Chargers secondary. We mentioned this in our Shadow Report this week, where I pinpointed the fact that Mike Evans and Cam Hart will most likely be isolated one-on-one. And Cam Hart most likely won't have much help. The fact that I don't necessarily believe that will be the one-on-one matchup throughout the entirety of this game proves to me the depth that the Chargers rely upon in the secondary to account for whatever your offense throws at them. They've had very limited success against high-powered offenses, and I'm not necessarily saying the Bucs are one, but they certainly can be when they're in the mood. But ultimately, I feel like Mike Evans is going to have a tough situation with how the Chargers defend him with so many different players that he could be quiet, surprisingly so. And I do think the Bucs have the talent needed to step up if he's been quiet in this game. But ultimately, I do feel like this is a risky take here, but it could be legitimate based off what I've seen from the Chargers defense this season. So make of that what you will. I still think a lot of you will want to roster him because he is still an elite, consistent wide receiver in that regard. But I do think this could be a very tough test for him. And I do think there's merit there in kind of hyping up this Chargers defense because they deserve it. They have proven time and time again that they are a very tough out for certain teams. And that's why the Bucs are playing with house money right now. I just don't necessarily see a good game for many Bucs receivers, and maybe not just Mike Evans. This could be a tough defensive slugfest, and it will come down to the play of both of these quarterbacks. But that's my take here on Mike Evans for this game. In terms of the tight end position, this is a guy who we talked about a little bit in this past segment, but we're going to have to highlight him in a negative manner now, Pat Freiermuth. And this is no indictment of him either, but I do think that, like I said, Russell Wilson is not too reliant in short to intermediate range in terms of middle of the field targets. I do feel like he still, no matter what's up with Pickens, is going to want to push it down the field. And he has developed a rapport with players outside of Pickens, like Calvin Austin, like, other players on this roster. But I do think that Pat Freiermuth has kind of gone a little bit too understated in this offense. Granted, he is a very potent red zone threat, and that could be the difference in this game against the Eagles, where I do believe that red zone touchdowns will be very hard to come by based off the play of these two defenses. But I do feel like Pat Freiermuth is not going to see many touches in this game, even if George Pickens doesn't play because he's still dealing with that little injury that he's had. But ultimately, look for Pat Freiermuth to be kind of a disappointment here in this matchup. As much as I love him in this Pittsburgh offense and what his importance could mean for the prospects of Pittsburgh come postseason time, I just don't think him and Russ are gelling right now. In certain situations they could be, but right now it's not really coalescing to the point where it's a reliable connection in this offense. They could prove me wrong in the playoffs, but right now I need to see more out of it to compel me to say that Pat Freiermuth could be an asset, not a detriment to your fantasy playoff team. And then last but not least, in terms of defense, this one is a pretty easy one as well. The Saints defense, which actually did a very admirable job against the New York Giants, but then again it's the New York Giants, and they're going to go up against a very ticked-off Commanders team coming off a bye after a kind of shaky run of form there, where they lost to a couple potential playoff teams they'll be facing yet again in the playoffs. So this one's going to be all hands on deck for the Saints trying to stop this high-powered Washington offense. And yes, a lot of people might say, well, that little run of form the Commanders had before their bye is indicative of the quote-unquote Cliff Kingsbury offensive collapse, where ultimately Cliff Kingsbury offenses look pretty hot to start the year but then crumble because they can't necessarily sustain it. I do think that this Washington Commanders offense is sustainable. They just got to get over these past couple of weeks. They really did not execute well in those games against these top contenders. Most of all, they weren't their efficient selves. And Pittsburgh and Philly were able to disrupt that, but then they got right against Tennessee. They're coming off the bye now, and they're probably foaming at the mouth to get a Saints team that really has looked bright under Darren Rizzi, but haven't necessarily seen as complex an offense as what Washington can throw at them. So that's why the Saints defense, even though you probably don't even think about them in terms of a playoff perspective, are my favorite sit of the week. Let me know what you think in the comments, because ultimately it's harder to determine who sits than who starts, just because you already know at this point who you're most likely going to put on your bench. But ultimately, it's still a fun thing to talk about, because you might have these leftover guys who you don't know what to do with and might want to throw out there to see what they're about, but it's the playoffs. So you have to think like it's crunch time rather than try and decipher how to put certain guys into your lineup week in, week out to conclude the season. But let me know what you think about this in the comments. Coming up next, we talk about the biggest stakes for certain NFL games from a fantasy standpoint. A lot of exciting ones to talk about. A lot of underrated ones as well. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, let's talk some huge fantasy stakes in the biggest games in the NFL weekend, first round of the fantasy playoffs. Now, I tried to include as many games as possible in terms of excitement level, in terms of key players to talk about, but ultimately I want to keep this as tiered as possible, going from most underrated to biggest matchups. And we have everything on the docket here in week 15 to talk about. A lot of games in which could be shocking or could give you the most fantasy production of the weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with the most underrated game of the weekend, in my opinion. A lot of people not talking about this one. Yes, we have so many headliners to talk about in terms of big games. We're talking about a lot of them today. But this one goes under the radar. Could be a crazy, unexpected fantasy thriller for you. How about Chiefs-Browns? Let's talk about this game. Because the last time these two teams met, I believe it was actually the divisional round game where it was an Arrowhead. Pat Mahomes went down late with a concussion. Chad Henne came in that crazy fourth down conversion. It was a very exciting game. But this time, Jameis Winston's at the helm for Cleveland. And with Jameis Winston comes a great chaos. A lot of people might be a lot more high on this Browns offense now, because a lot of people were selling certain Browns players. They were happy that Amari Cooper got rid of and went to Buffalo. They were happy that, all these players were now being able to be sold. But now a lot of people are buying into the Browns based on the hype that Jameis Winston brings to them. And so I do believe that this Browns team will play with heart and passion in this one, unlike a lot of teams playing the Chiefs who kind of falter late. And this could be a shocking upset in that regard with a lot of fantasy stakes, because we still think of the Chiefs as one of the better teams in terms of a fantasy perspective week in, week out. You always have to think about both Mahomes and Kelsey, and now certain weapons like Worthy can still be a vertical threat. DeAndre Hopkins is an exciting threat, and all those different pieces like Pacheco, Gray, Watson, what have you. But now you're also looking at the Browns in this matchup like they could be the even more exciting fantasy team here. In terms of Jameis, he could still be a potential shocking playoff start for you. Jerry Jeudy has really come into his own with Jameis at the helm. David Njoku, we talked about him. A real boomer bust player who, when he's on, he's one of the best tight ends in the league. let's talk about this defense, who, yes, has been a little bit more underwhelming than they were last year, but still has a lot of juice to them. I think this is going to be one of the most surprising matchups in terms of fantasy production. So don't underestimate both of these teams producing huge, gaudy fantasy numbers for you this first round of the fantasy playoffs. And I think that ultimately, both of these teams are going to be analyzed in so many different ways, because you look at the Chiefs as a front runner, and you look at the Browns as kind of a spoiler team. And together, they become a really intriguing entity. And so that's why I have to highlight this game, because of the fact that a lot of people are underestimating what it could look like. And I think that it could be a shocker here. So look for this one to kind of help you make last-minute decisions about your fantasy roster for this first-round playoff matchup. Now let's talk about a game with a little bit more things at stake in it, and a couple more key players that could also be boom or bust. Let's talk Colts Broncos here. That's the graphic. This could be a very intriguing analysis of two QBs, two young QBs at that, who could define the future of fantasy sports as we know it. Because both of them have such fantastic raw potential. One, I believe right now, is developing it more maturely, while the other still needs a little bit more time and growth in his respective offense to see his potential really come true. But I do believe that this matchup, right, is exciting from a fantasy perspective because of the defenses in it. These are two sneaky good units. The Broncos more so than the Colts, but I appreciate what the Colts have done. Let's not forget what they did to the Vikings coming off the bye. Yes, the Vikings looked a little rattled in that match, but that Colts defense had perhaps one of the best performances against the Vikings offense of anyone this year. Even better than the Detroit Lions did. And that's saying something. And I think that it will come down to which defense can really rattle the explosiveness involved in both of these quarterbacks' play. Because Bo Nix, I do feel like, at this point, has seen the vision Sean Payton has for him and has developed his talents and his traits to the better ability at this point of his career. But Anthony Richardson, let's not forget, still only started, 15, 16 times in the NFL, and in each of his starts, he's done something that not many NFL quarterbacks can do. And he has the explosive play ability, much similar to Bo Nix. But I do think at the end of the day, both of these quarterbacks' explosiveness will be tested by these defenses. And a lot of fantasy football owners might be making more last-minute decisions about their defenses rather than trying to decipher two rookie quarterbacks. But look for these two guys to be talking points in the future. But in this matchup, look at the defenses as the present to what this game can be. Because a lot of people might be having more questions about the defense than their QB position, because they might be a little bit more settled, so to speak, at the QB position than the defense. But if you have a lot of questions about the defense, then look no further than the Colts and Broncos, because this could be a surprisingly defensive slugfest that could be dividends for your fantasy roster. Then let's get bigger and bigger here in terms of real-life stakes and fantasy stakes. Potential Super Bowl preview that everyone is talking about. Bills, Lions here. And I feel like this game, yes, is primed to be a hugely offensive showdown. We have two of the most efficient, electrifying offenses in the NFL. But it's about how this distribution of talent, this distribution of wealth, more specifically, goes around that complicates things for fantasy football owners. I talked a little bit about the Bills situation, with Amari Cooper might having to step up a little bit more should both Coleman and Kincaid be absent from this game. I talked about the potentiality of James Cook in this offense as well. He can get going at any given moment for this Bills offense. I talked about the yak ability of a guy like Khalil Shakir, but it's all about how Josh Allen pulls the strings for this offense because he can do whatever he pleases. He can play hero ball. He can allow these talented weapons to do things outside of himself, or he can look to the backfield a little bit more and kind of let things dictate themselves. That's how special Josh Allen has been this season. Whereas on the Lions side of the football, it's definitely a lot more structured, but it's structured in a way that they can also vary who gets a lot of touches in this offense. You can either go to two of the best running backs in the league and have them impose their will, or Jared Goff's incisive efficiency can play big roles in this game, but you never know who's going to pass to because he has Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, and Sam Laporta to look at, and Tim Patrick emerging in this offense as well. So that's the question here. If you are looking at Bills and Lions players to carry you in this fantasy postseason, who do you believe is going to be the most important down the stretch for these two teams? Because let's be clear here. These are two teams who have clinched a playoff spot and might not even be worrying about starting many of these players in the coming weeks. So that's a key factor here in how you look at this game. But in this particular matchup, it's just going to come down to who on the day performs or overachieves at their position. Because these are two of the best fantasy teams in the league to look at and analyze. But it's tough considering the fact that they have so much talent that you don't necessarily know who would give you the most fantasy production. And that's the key here. I still think both of these teams have a clear definition of who they know they can rely upon, but it's just a question of how this game pans out, because this could look to be a defensive slugfest. We don't know at this point. But it's going to be key to get it right. So I feel like this game is so confusing and confounding in how it can be defined, but it's ultimately a grab bag of talent for it. And if you get it wrong, you get it wrong. And if you get it right, you potentially win your first round matchup. So that's the difficulty of deciphering this kind of matchup. And then last but not least, let's talk about a more defensive struggle, or what I believe will be a more defensive struggle, in my opinion, in this potential Super Bowl matchup. How about the Steelers going up against the Eagles? And this matchup, like I say on my screen here in this graphic, could be a shocking defensive slugfest. Because like I said, these quarterbacks in both Russell Wilson and Jalen Hurts are intent on doing different things for their offenses. For Jalen Hurts, it's about letting Saquon Barkley be the X factor here. And it's kind of to his detriment, right? Because at this point, Jalen Hurts' job as a passer is too simple, not turning the ball over. And so if it's too simplified for Jalen Hurts, in a game like this, or in a game come playoff time, where he's actually doing a little bit more, where defenses are a lot more tough, how will he step up? And that's a question I don't think he'll answer in even this matchup. Whereas the Steelers side of things, Russell Wilson, I feel like, has to be a little bit more decisive in all areas of the field, rather than just immediately turning to the deep ball to get this offense going. He's been able to get the play action game going, which I love to see from him. And for the most part, he has been able to remain a little bit mobile for this offense as well. But ultimately, it comes back to the deep ball and how over-reliant he can seem to be in that aspect. So that's why I feel like this game's going to become a little bit sluggish. That's like what we saw last night. Let's not talk about that right now. Because I do feel these two teams are perfectly capable of putting up points. I'm not going to shy away from the offensive weapons they have, like I kind of alluded to by mentioning Saquon, my favorite starts of the week. But the way I see it, I think both of these defenses merit consideration as well in this matchup. It's not going to be all offensive fireworks. I think that these are two defenses who you might want to carry through your fantasy postseason if you want to play it that way, because they truly are two special defenses that could be as integral to your success as a high-end wide receiver. And that's saying something. So look for this game to really say something about these two defenses rather than potentially these two offenses. Let me know what you think about these games in the comments. But coming up, let's talk about a big game Sunday night, one that I'll be watching very closely as my Seahawks take on the Packers in a renewal of one of the best rivalries in football these past 2 decades, right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment for today's show, let's talk about one game that I will definitely, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, be watching very closely with a lot at stake for both of these NFC playoff hopefuls, Packers, Seahawks. Now, I actually thought, funnily enough, that the Sunday night game for some reason was Steelers-Eagles because it showed up when I look at my ESPN app as the last game there. But since I'm a Seahawks fan, I starred them as one of my favorite teams. They kind of rose up, and that's why I thought that way. So I had to kind of rejigger a couple things for my segments. But ultimately, I'm excited to talk about this game more in depth because, well, it is my favorite team we're discussing here. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Green Bay, let's talk about the betting perspective first and then get into the key factors in this one. Green Bay on the road, 2.5-point favorites, the over-under 45.5, so potentially a highly low-scoring game here. Green Bay minus 140 in terms of money line, Seattle plus 120, so ultimately a very close game between two very similar teams in many different ways. But let's break it down. Let's talk about the Packers first, because I do feel like out of all the teams Seattle have played in the past 4 weeks in terms of their 4-game winning streak, no team will test them like the Packers can. They have a talented tight end in Tucker Kraft, who's one thing. They have a talented running back in Josh Jacobs who can impose his will. And you have a quarterback who has a wealth of receivers who at any given time can step up and say they're the wide receiver one. So that's going to be very difficult for the Seattle defense. But if any defense right now can slow down this Packers offense, it looks to be the Seattle Seahawks, surprisingly. And not many people have said that at the midpoint of the season when they had their bye week. But after the bye week, I was reading an article about this a little bit earlier, they have been statistically one of the best defenses in all of football. First, in terms of defensive EPA per play against the pass, 5th against the run. And I feel like, the way I see it, this is indicative of what Mike McDonald does to a certain defense. He did with Baltimore in his first year there, where they kind of got off to a slow start and became one of the better units on the stretch, and now he's doing with Seattle. And the difference is, he's trusting a lot more of his corners and secondary players to hang tight in man coverage, take away the deep plays in this offense. And so we're seeing this defense, even though they haven't really gotten as much pressure as they had early in this season in terms of getting to the quarterback, really stick home in coverage, whether it be in too high, cover 2, cover 4. In certain situations, we've really seen how aggressive the secondary can get. And they have 2 of the better corners in the league, young ones at that, Enrique Woolen and Devin Witherspoon. And so that's been a huge part of this defensive resurgence for Seattle. But when I look at this Packers team, they're well equipped to not care about that. They're well equipped to beat you horizontally rather than vertically. They love the short yardage game. They love relying on Josh Jacobs both as a rusher and a receiver. And that's really going to challenge this Seahawks defense laterally. And most importantly, Jordan Love's going to be a huge X factor in this one. And I feel like Jordan Love's play in the short to intermediate areas of the field, especially in the red zone, is highly integral to the Packers' success in this game. Can he really get it to his most physical weapons, like Tucker Kraft, like Jaden Reed, in certain situations? And then, in certain situations as well, in early downs, have Josh Jacobs try and wear down the Seahawks front seven to the point where they can open up and get explosive down the field for a guy like Christian Watson or Romeo Doubs. And so that's why I feel like this Packers offense is more multifaceted than anything thrown at Seattle these past 4 weeks. This is not an indictment of Seattle because I still love them as a fan, but I do think that's where the difference between these two teams is brought to light. Between the multifaceted nature of this Packers offense that can really attack Seattle in a way as this defense really has been challenged. And so that's the difference here for me. On the Seattle side of things, as Tyler Sperry comes into the chat and says, don't promote Charbonnet unless Walker is out. I'm not saying I'll promote Charbonnet wholeheartedly, but I do think that if Walker is out, Charbonnet has a chance to have another decent day here. Because on the Seattle side of things, the way they look offensively actually will play into a more physical style than we've seen from them. Because this season, Seattle has come up passing because they're kind of forced to, right? This line simply can't run block that well and haven't had enough continuity to do it at a high level as a result. So ultimately, they've had to pass a lot more than they've wanted to. But in those situations, Geno has been very efficient, especially in third and long and fourth and long situations. Geno has been incredibly efficient in those situations. And so I do feel like, though, in this matchup, to really take control of the game, they're going to want to feed the ball to who's ever at the running back position, as Tyler alluded to. And if it's Charbonnet, I actually think he'll have a better opportunity than Kenneth Walker, because Walker's more about getting a little bit shifty at the line, whereas Charbonnet makes the right read according to what he sees and just takes it up the middle. And so that's what is the difference here for me in terms of the effectiveness of the Seahawks run game. Can both of these guys, no matter who's running the football, just make the correct reads at the line and help out their O-line as a result? If that's the case, then look for the Seahawks to try and take control of this game away from what the Packers can do offensively. And most importantly, remain on schedule and in rhythm. Because that's the thing with this Seahawks offense. Right? The defense is trying to take care of things in terms of limiting what offenses can do very well. Seattle, on offense, just trying to remain as efficient as possible. But I do think in terms of the pass game, we're going to see a lot more DK Metcalf than JSN in this one. Not an indictment of JSN either, because he's truly been remarkable for what he's done for Seattle this season, especially in the slot as well. And I feel like everyone is really jumping on the JSN bandwagon. But let's not forget about DK Metcalf and what he can do, not just as a route runner, but physically as well. To physically challenge a Packers defense that's going to predicate itself on takeaways. Really going to test Geno in terms of disguising coverages, in terms of tempting him in certain situations. And so DK Metcalf's physicality can be a huge difference maker. And we'll talk about this in our next segment as well, in how this game is played. As Tyler mentioned, everyone is saying Charbonnet is like Derrick Henry. If Walker plays, Charbonnet will only get 4 carries. And I agree with that sentiment, right? Because they want to get Kenneth Walker going. He can be a huge asset to this offense when he does get going. But I think that a large part of it is the offensive line and what Walker does, whether it be to their success or to their detriment. I do feel like when I look at both of them on a per-game basis, I feel like Charbonnet has been the one to have helped out this offensive line a little bit more. And this is not an indictment of Walker as a runner. I think he's a fabulous player. But I do feel like in certain situations, he misreads the line and the way they pull, and especially in short yardage situations as well, which I'm really frustrated about and what this game could ultimately come down to. But also, when I look at Charbonnet, when he's asked to step up is the difference here. I feel like, the reason why I feel like Charbonnet could have a decent game if Kenneth Walker is absent is exactly for that reason. Because when he's the focal point of this offense, that's where he shines. But I agree that when Kenneth Walker is in, this offense and this offensive line as a result kind of stagnates because Charbonnet is not necessarily back there making the reads. It's also, Tyler says Jair Alexander is playing. I didn't even know he was injured, so Metcalf will have a tough day if Alexander plays. I kind of disagree with that sentiment because I feel like DK Metcalf is going to be physical enough and going to want to set the tone in the passing game in terms of especially short yardage situation. So I do think that Metcalf won't even care if Jair Alexander plays or not. And I actually didn't even know Jair Alexander was injured, so that's on me. But ultimately, I do think when I look at what Seattle's offense can do in the pass game, it can remain efficient whether it's JSN or DK Metcalf. It's just that against a tough defense like the Packers, I think DK will matter more. It might not even be about him having a good or bad day. It might just come down to him being physical and really testing and occupying these Packers corners to kind of open up maybe for JSN and Lockett. But ultimately, when I think about this matchup, I think that Jair Alexander hasn't necessarily been tested physically by a receiver. And remember this, the Packers are 1-4 in games against a team in the NFC with a winning record. And whenever they go to Seattle, and yes, this is of a bygone era kind of, magical things happen. However, I do think that it will come down to the Packers' offense versus Seattle's defense. I just don't think Seattle's defense has been tested in a way. I do think it will be a high-scoring game. Seattle could potentially cover in this one as well, but I am going to take the Packers, like I mentioned when I was making my picks yesterday, just because I don't necessarily think that ultimately Seattle can keep up with this team. But this is not an indictment of my Seahawks, and it proves that I'm kind of unbiased here in what I pick for them. But ultimately, it's going to come down to that Packers offense and how effective they can be. And I just think they can be a little bit more effective than that Seattle defense. But ultimately, who knows? Like I said, magic happens when these two teams play in Seattle, and might be for the home team this time. But let's see what you guys think in the comments as well, like Tyler Sperry mentioned. But coming up next, we talk a little bit more about this game from a stardom sit-in perspective, giving y'all some fantasy advice in that department. So we'll be right back to conclude today's show with that. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And to conclude today's show, we're going to be continuing with our Sunday Night Football talk, more so from a fantasy standpoint, giving you some stardom cinnamon advice in this matchup, because it could also, much like all the games I talked about, the huge fantasy stakes, mean a lot in your first round playoff matchup. A lot of players, whether they be waiver wire additions or guaranteed starters for you week in, week out, will mean a lot in this matchup as well. I do think that this matchup will see a lot more physicality out of both of these teams than I think. And I think that ultimately, that's the way this game is going to go. It's either going to be a high-scoring affair where ultimately both of these offenses are going to be hyper-efficient, or it's going to come down to the defensive play. Both of these elite defenses really getting home on both of these offenses. But as we'll see in this start, I'm kind of favoring the more physical players in that regard. And even though, it's going to be a little bit tougher to see from a Seattle side of things going up against this Packers defense, and you might have to get a little bit more imaginative in that department, I do think that their physicality can be a difference maker for them on that side of the football. So without further ado, let us jump right into our final segment of the day, talking about some guys you might want to start and some guys you might want to sit for this matchup. Starting off with the Packers here, because I think it's a little bit more clear as to what their game plan could be here. They're going to want to test the Seattle run defense. And I feel like, that might be the weaker department for Seattle even after this bye week in terms of really rising up the ranks from in the mid-20s to 5th overall in defensive EPA per play against the run. But ultimately, that's kind of where I see some limitations and deficiencies still in the Seattle defense if I had to nitpick any one thing I've seen from their improvement. So Josh Jacobs, for me, looks to be not a guaranteed start because it's still going to be a tough matchup for him, but kind of close to a start where you could confidently say he can have success. Because I think about how the Packers will want to set up in the pass game as well. And I do think it will stem from what Josh Jacobs does. Because if Josh Jacobs gets going, then potentially a lot more options can be available to you from a fantasy perspective. Maybe guys like Jaden Reed can step up here. Maybe guys like Christian Watson could have been on this list. But it all starts and ends with Josh Jacobs and how he sets the tone early in this game against that Seattle front. If he doesn't get going, then it could spell a long night for these Packers receivers. So that's why I feel like Josh Jacobs is going to be someone who's going to be an X factor in this game, and as a result, going to see a lot of touches and potentially a lot of fantasy production as well. And in terms of another physical player for this team who could be another X factor here as well, got to take a risk here in terms of who among that skill position core is going to stand out. Tucker Kraft, a player I mentioned a little bit recently in this show, but someone who I think very highly of as a red zone threat. He is the physical man for this Packers offense. And I do believe that should the Packers sustain enough drives throughout this game to the point where they're going to be in the red zone more often than not, then Tucker Kraft will have a huge say in what they do down there. Because of the fact he's going to be a physical presence to the Seahawks, might simply not be able to account for if they're struggling covering these multifaceted receivers. So that's where I see kind of a mismatch here that the Packers will want to exploit, because Tucker Kraft is a very difficult tight end to defend in terms of how physical he can get, not just in the open field, but especially in the red zone. And that's a lot of where you want to see good production from a tight end if you're a fantasy player, because red zone touchdowns for tight ends are what matter the most, in my opinion. And so Tucker Kraft has been one of the best, so look for him to continue with that should Seattle be too concerned with these receivers. So he might get a lot of targets and looks in this one as a result. And then in terms of sitting, I do believe that Jordan Love is not going to have as big a game as people might expect. And I do believe that it will stem down to him protecting the football, him really relying on Josh Jacobs, and him really relying on just nice, easy routes to kind of get into a rhythm here. Because I do believe that both of these teams will kind of be playing a little bit tactically to start things off. Really your move, my move kind of situation going on early in the game. And as a result, I don't necessarily think Jordan Love will have as gaudy of numbers as people think. And I do believe that in certain situations, perhaps the Seattle front will get home on him. Because I do think that while Jordan Love has looked miles better than he did kind of after the bye when he came back from injury to now, I do think that in some moments it gets a little bit tentative. And so, even though Seattle's not calling as much pressure, dialing it up, they still can get home, and that's going to be a little bit tricky if Jordan Love wants to hold onto the football a little bit too much. So that's something to monitor and analyze in this game as well, should you kind of want to monitor Jordan Love from a playoff standpoint, but a long-term future standpoint as well. But I do think he will have to be a sit in this situation. Then, as well, this Packers defense. Now, I do think that coming into this matchup, they'll feel like they can take advantage of some of the things that the Seattle offense does. But I don't necessarily think they face a team who relies on efficiency as well as the Seahawks. And that's something that I don't necessarily feel that the Packers are going to be betting on. They're going to be betting on mistakes from Geno Smith. And while he has made more than any other quarterback in the league at this point, in certain situations, especially these past 2 weeks, he has proven he can remain efficient and keep this offense on schedule, which is something that he wants to do a lot more of rather than being too over-reliant on himself. And if Geno Smith can revert to more of a game manager style of play rather than having to play hero, that's a good sign for the Seattle offense. And I think that, in terms of keeping pace with the Packers, they're going to just want to play their way in their style of football, which might also look at, increased touches for whoever at the running back position. So look for this Packers defense to face a totally different style of attack from this Seahawks offense than anything they faced this season in terms of wanting to remain efficient, because other teams have tried to beat them with explosiveness or imposing their will. Seattle's going to try and do it tactically. Seattle's going to try and remain as efficient as possible, especially on early downs, because they don't necessarily want to get into those situations, even though they are exceptional at them in terms of late downs. But I do feel like there's a situation where the Packers defense might look a little bit more shaky than we've seen them all year against the Seattle team. Now, from a Seattle standpoint here, let's talk about who I could see being a positive start here from a fantasy perspective for you. And it all comes down to who starts at running back, right? Because a lot of people are on the Zach Charbonnet hype train, and rightfully so. This is someone who I didn't necessarily would think would step up in certain situations, including the absence of Kenneth Walker. But I do feel that if he gets the start, he projects to look better behind this offensive line than Kenneth Walker. And this is not, again, an indictment of what Kenneth Walker can bring to this offense, because we know when he's at his best what he can be. But Zach Charbonnet has proven that he can just get the job done and impose his will. That's something this offensive line needs, right? Because they do struggle in running situations. Then I don't necessarily know if you would want a guy like Kenneth Walker trying to create space for himself rather than a guy in Charbonnet who just wants to get downfield in a hurry. So that makes a huge difference at the running back position for Seattle. But I do think that if you're looking for someone to start, if Zach Charbonnet gets the start, then he's the guy who you think you should start over Kenneth Walker. And I never thought I would be saying it, but let's be real here. I do think Seattle's offensive line will be heavily tested in this one, and it will come down to the run game. And I just think Zach Charbonnet has looked better in certain situations than Kenneth Walker for this run game. And so that's why I think that should he start, he's going to be a viable fantasy asset yet again for your first round playoff matchup. In terms of the wide receiver position, I mentioned this as well and alluded to this. Physicality is going to be important here. A little bit more so than efficiency, because while I think that Seattle can remain on schedule in this game, I do think that the cornerbacks here are really going to test Geno. And I feel like DK Metcalf in those situations is going to play a huge difference. Because if you occupy these Green Bay corners in a way that physically tests them, then it opens up a lot of what JSN can do. And I actually put JSN as a sit just because I do feel that early on in this game, it's going to be testy for the Seattle offense, deciding what it wants to do. And so I do feel like DK Metcalf is going to have the bigger say overall in this game, because of the fact that not only can he create space for himself, but create space for others in terms of how physical he can get. And while I don't necessarily think he's going to get as many targets as, say, a JSN or a Lockett in this matchup, I do think they'll be more meaningful because of how he can wear down the Packers' defense, unlike any Seattle receiver. So look for DK Metcalf to be an intriguing start here, and JSN to be kind of one of those players who might disappoint in this one. And it might just be a one-game thing because the Packers are such a unique defense where you're going to have to rely on one of your receivers creating space. But ultimately, I do feel like down the stretch for Seattle, it could come down to DK Metcalf's physicality over JSN's shiftiness. And that's something that I feel a lot of people might disagree with, but I still think is merited here. So look for DK Metcalf to be a surprising start potentially for you in JSN. And then in terms of sit as well, the Seahawks defense, because as much as I love their improvements, I think this is one step too far for them in terms of defending this offense. They definitely have the capabilities to do so, but it's all going to come down to how they defend a guy like Tucker Kraft. I really think Tucker Kraft's going to be the issue here in terms of how to cover him. And while they've proven that they can cover very physical tight ends, much like they did against Trey McBride this past week, I do feel that Tucker Kraft is going to be a huge difference maker because of the fact that you have so many different receivers to worry about as well, unlike with the Cardinals. So that's why I feel that the Seattle defense make it testable. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments, because that will just about do it for the day and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in all week. Remember, as always, like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you want more content such as this. Also, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers videos here on YouTube all throughout the show if you want to contribute and interact. But other than that, I am out for the week. See you on Monday.